Hello everyone, my name is Monika Deviat and I am presenting on night photography, my favorite genre. In this presentation, I'm going to go over a little bit of introduction about myself, gear, because that kind of matters for night photography, talk a little bit about safety for your own adventures, planning night shoots, and then talk a little bit about creativity. So let's start with the introduction. I actually started as a concert photographer. That was the main thing I shot for almost 7 years. I traveled all over North America, shooting shows, festivals. I even went on a couple heavy metal cruises, so out on international waters. And so I was kind of used to shooting in the dark, low light conditions, and I knew how to deal with the challenges. In 2014, I actually took my first Milky Way photo. I was out in the Okanagan in British Columbia, wine country. I had joined my family on vacation, and I decided I wanted to try shooting sunrise, sunset while I was out there. So I was looking for some ideas of where to go shoot, and I came across this photographer who had amazing Milky Way photos. It had never crossed my mind that that would be something I could shoot, and I was intrigued. So I emailed the guy, and I said, hey, will you take me out? And I want to try this. And he did. And so I didn't really know what I was doing. I found a few tips online, but otherwise I just kind of guessed, tried things. So this was my first shot. It's not bad composition-wise, but it was actually a little bit out of focus. So I'm going to talk about techniques in a bit. I would say I really got into night photography in the spring of 2015. I started going around to kind of well-known sunrise sunset spots and shooting. So this is Vermilion Lakes in Banff. And so like I mentioned, a very popular sunrise spot. You've probably seen a lot of photos from this area, but I'd never seen a Milky Way photo here. And as I was trying to figure out how to get really good Milky Way shots, I started learning how to plan and figure out where to go so I could actually get some interesting compositions. Initially, I was just kind of hanging out in badland type areas, rural areas, places where you could just drive and maybe walk for a few minutes to get to a good spot, get some interesting compositions. But then I got it into my head that I wanted to shoot the Milky Way from the summit of a mountain. And so it's actually night photography that got me into hiking and outdoor adventures. This is a shot from my first ever summit shoot, and it was actually probably the most miserable one I've ever done. It was really cold, it was super windy, and it seemed impossible to get any shelter from the wind, but this is an absolutely fantastic experience. To be up so high, far away from everyone, and to get a shot that you envisioned work out after all the effort. So those are my favorite types of adventures. I've done quite a few summit shoots since then. I have a growing list that I'm trying to tick off, and sometimes it takes a bit of time to get all the conditions to line up. So it's a bit of a challenge, but I guess I like a challenge. I do also bring a bit of my heavy metal side into the night photography. I actually took this photo immediately after Black Sabbath's last show in Calgary. I think we left the venue at midnight, and then I drove for 3 hours to try and catch the Milky Way rising because we thought we had a pretty good clear sky window. Another example of my heavy metal side coming through. This is at Abraham Lake, famously known for its methane bubbles. And I thought this bubble pattern looked really cool because it looked like a shattered skull. And then I have Orion positioned above the mountains. Okay, so let's talk about gear, because as I mentioned, that's kind of an important component. I'll start with what I use. So I currently have the D810 and the D850. They're absolutely fantastic. The D3S was my workhorse for concerts, and it's what I started with for night photography and hiking, but it was pretty heavy, so I upgraded pretty quick. I did have a demo version of the Z7, which I took out for a few night shoots, and I really enjoyed using that. My go-to lens is the 14 to 24 f2.8. It's such a good night lens, and of course landscape lens as well. Some other lenses I use for my night photos are the 20mm f1.8, the 24 to 70, 70-200 2.8, and sometimes I even use my 50mm 1.4. You also need a tripod, and you can use the timer in your camera, but I do like to have an intervalometer or a wireless remote. And the other thing you can have with you is lighting, but I don't have too much time to talk about that in this presentation. When you're considering what might be best for you, if you want to try night photography, you can use what you have. You can always start with what you have and practice and learn the techniques. Budget is usually one of the first considerations for people, but of course you can do upgrading as you go. Sensor capabilities are going to be something to consider, and also the types of lenses. So the settings and how to capture a night photo section will also tell you a little bit about what kind of gear you might want. Your very basic setup is a camera and an appropriate lens. You're going to need a tripod because your exposure times are going to be quite long, and anytime you press your shutter, you can introduce some shake. You need a remote, the timer on your camera, or an intervalometer. You're going to have to manual focus, and you pick your settings. Everything's going to be manual, and then you're going to shoot. So I have some manual focusing tips for you because I find this to be the most challenging aspect of night photography for people. So if you have a zoom lens, you're going to have to pick your focal length. Otherwise, if you have a prime, you just have one. What you're going to do is use live view and find the brightest star in your frame, in your composition. If you're having a really hard time, I recommend turning your camera in a completely different direction if you need to find something bright that you can focus on. I don't recommend turning on lights and trying to focus on an object because every time you turn on the light, you ruin your night vision, which takes away from the enjoyment of those dark skies. So once you've found your bright star on your LCD, you're going to zoom in just on the LCD, adjust your focus ring until that star is a pinpoint. And then remember to be careful not to bump your focus after this, and do keep checking your focus, especially if you move the camera or tripod. A prime lens trick, if you don't want to be dealing with focusing in the dark every time, you can just go out in the daytime and mark infinity with a marker or tape. Next up is settings. So we're going to consider what your camera is capable of. What are your options with lenses? What are you trying to capture subject-wise? And overall, it comes down to how much light can you get in? We'll start with ISO, so the sensitivity to light. So the higher the ISO, the more light you can get into your sensor, but you also get more noise. So that's just something we have to deal with in night photography. A general rule of thumb people use is to use the highest numbered ISO possible, but I recommend going out with your camera and just doing a test. Just run through some high ISO values, see what you're comfortable with. These three examples I have are from my D3S, so that's a 12 megapixel camera. At this scale, you can tell that there's some brightness differences in the image, but I wouldn't say that you could see much of a difference in the noise from 1600 to 6400. So the other thing to consider is where are these images going? If they're just going to go on social media, online, and they're going to be small scale, you're definitely probably not that worried about the noise. Let's look at some images from my D850. So 6400 is actually where I hang out for my single exposure shots. 12,800 I'll bump to sometimes, definitely if I'm doing a method for stacking out noise where you take multiple images and then use an external software program to get rid of some noise. At this scale, you can again see the difference in the brightness, but I wouldn't say you can see too much of a difference in the noise. Once we really zoom in, you can start to see that speckly noise and maybe some differences. So, if I'm printing these really big, and which I do consider how the noise will look. And of course, there is a certain point where the noise does look bad, no matter what the scale is, and this will depend on each camera. In this example, you can start to see that kind of TV grain noise, some color casting. So definitely for me, this would be pushing it too much. Lenses and f-stops. So for night photography, something 2.8 or faster is really good. If you have an f4, for example, that would totally work, especially if you're just learning, you want to practice, and that's what you're starting with. But if you really want to try and get some good night images, get some more light in, you need something faster. The other thing to consider with your lenses is the coma. So in the corner, I have two examples from corners of images. So in the 14 to 24, basically my go-to, I love this lens, you can barely see any coma, and that's kind of like that spaceshipy like shape or weird shape to the stars. They no longer look like circles or rectangles. In the 50 millimeter, I mean, this one has a bit more. This is like in the extreme corner of the image, but you can start to see there's more of that effect. So something to consider. Wide angles are great for nightscapes where you're including stars and some sort of foreground. But there's also use for longer focal lengths and faster apertures. I'm going to roll through a set of examples. These were all taken in the same area, but different times, to show you the effect of different focal lengths. So this is with my 50 millimeter, and I'm using the Milky Way as an example. So in this picture, the Milky Way looks really big, like it really stands out. That core, this detailed section, it's towering over the mountains. This is an example at 24 millimeters. So essentially we're like zooming out. The Milky Way doesn't look so big compared to the mountains. We're including more of the scene. 14 millimeters, of course, we're including even more, zooming out more essentially, a lot more of the Milky Way arm, a little bit more of that reflection. And I'll also show you this example. So this is a panorama created with that 50 millimeter lens, 40 images, 4 rows of 10, all stitched together later on. And the reason I use the 50 millimeter is because at 1.4, I'm letting in so much more light, I can get a ton of detail. And of course, because it's a panorama, this will print really big with lots of detail in it. Next up is exposure times. So the stars appear to move through the sky for us. So the narrower field of view, the shorter time it takes for a star to trail across your picture area. If you think of standing in a very open, like the prairies, for example, and there's a car driving on a highway very far away from you, it's going to seem like it takes a while to travel across your field of view. If you're standing right in front of that highway, that car is going to zip by super fast. Now, there is a device that moves your camera at the same rate as the stars move, a star tracker. I do have one of those, but not going to go into too much detail on that. So the way we mitigate star trails, if we don't want them, if we want pinpoint stars, it used to be that we would use these 6, 5, or 400 rules. And what these rules are is they say you take one of these values, so say 500, and you divide it by your focal length, and that will give you the time that you can shoot for, so your stars still look like a pinpoint and not a line. With the high resolution cameras now, this doesn't work as well. And also crop factors will affect your time. So if you have a full frame, that is better for night photography usually. And the way I decide, besides just testing out the times, is using an app called PhotoPills. It has a lot of useful tools in it, but you can give it your camera. So in this case, I have my D810 and your focal length. So I said 14 millimeters. And it calculates for you. So with the 500 rule, it says, oh, you can shoot for 36 seconds. But if I want pinpoint accurate stars, taking into account the megapixels of the camera, apparently I could only shoot for 8 seconds, which isn't very long. And it could leave your pictures looking kind of dark. So then there's another option, and you can say, well, it's okay if my stars trail a little bit. They don't need to be pinpoints. And then the calculation says 16 seconds. Let's look at some examples. So when I was first shooting with my D3S, again, that's just a 12 megapixel camera, I would shoot for 30 seconds. And the stars trailed a little bit, especially in the corners, but when you print it, when you look at it on a screen, it looks great. Let's look at some examples from my D810. So I have 20 seconds, 15, and 10. At this scale, you can definitely see the difference in brightness between 10 and 20, but I wouldn't say that you could tell that the stars are different shapes. If we really zoom in, then I could say, yes, the 10-second looks more like a pinpoint. The 20-second is maybe 1.5 times bigger, but it's not a huge difference. And for me, I usually shoot around, like for a 14 millimeter lens, I'll usually stick to 20-25 seconds because I do want to get more light in. I do want to bring out those details in the night sky. If I really want pinpoint stars, I'm going to pull out that star tracker that I have. Now, of course, you can do star trails on purpose. This is an example of a single shot, 300 seconds, with a 36 millimeter lens to just get those stars moving through the sky above the mountain peaks. This is a star trail created with multiple images. So the camera was running for 2 hours, taking a series of shots. I'm pointing directly north. That's why you see the concentric circles. And then later I blend all my images together to create this star trail image. If you have aurora, this might affect how you choose your shutter speeds. In this case, I picked 8 seconds. Those big curtains on the left side, I would say they weren't moving very fast. But those tiny spikes and pillars that you can see in the green and purple band on the right, that was moving a bit quicker. So had my shutter speed been too long, I could potentially average out some of the structures of the aurora. Here's an example of aurora again, but a panorama. So this one, I shot each individual image at 2.5 seconds. The reason I was doing this is so I could move relatively quickly, so to speak, because this is a 360-degree panorama. I didn't want the aurora to change too much as I traveled around to create the full 360 image. And sometimes if your shutter speeds are too long for aurora panoramas, your programs can have a tough time blending everything together. White balance. I do like to set a constant Kelvin at night. In the daytime, I'll usually just leave it on auto. But at night, I do kind of like to see something consistent, especially if I'm shooting time lapses, star trails. I kind of like to see what it looks like regardless of what might change in the night sky, like light pollution and anything else that might happen in there. So 50 to 100K is sunlight. 3800 generally cooler. On my camera, I usually set it around 3800, and then later when I'm editing, I'll tweak that, kind of depending on what's going on in the night sky. So here I have 4 examples going from 3200 to 5200, and in this case, my final choice was the 4500K one. I wanted to bring out some of those yellows, and also the kind of green purpley streaks you see, that's air glow. So I did want those colors to pop out a little bit. This one is really personal preference. I generally like things cooler. Some people like them warmer. Couple notes on safety. So when you're going out in the dark, always let someone know where you're going and kind of your plan so that they know where to find you if you don't show up at home when you're supposed to. I bring a friend has a question mark because I do actually go by myself a lot. For some of my summit adventures, I do try and find a friend, but it's kind of hard to find people that are up for hiking in the dark and spending nights on mountaintops in kind of somewhat miserable conditions. And sometimes I go very last minute. I find a clear sky window and I have to be ready to go. Be prepared for your adventures. Know where you're going, have appropriate gear, know your experience level, abilities, and foundations, and know the risks involved. Whether you're going for a rural drive or a hike in the dark, there's quite a few risks involved in any of those. A couple notes on etiquette. I always start with leave no trace. This is very important to me. I teach workshops in the field in a lot of national parks. I want to preserve the areas for other people that will come through. Know any park regulations and restrictions where you're going. Be mindful of your car lights, headlamps, camera lights. They can get in your own shots, they can get in other people's shots, or even just accidentally wreck your night vision. And a good rule is to ask people if they're shooting before turning on any lights or light painting, just to make sure nothing wrecks anyone's shot. To talk about some of the subjects you can shoot. So we'll start with my two favorites, the Milky Way. Obviously, there's been a lot of Milky Way photos. I'm kind of lucky at my latitude, roughly 51 degrees north. I can get aurora and Milky Way shots, which is super cool to get all those arcs. Aurora, we're not that far north where I am, but far enough that we can get some really cool shows when it's actually active. I've caught lightning storms with geomagnetic storms. And then, of course, the picket fence in the bottom right corner, and that purple streak is the phenomenon known as Steve. If you're somewhere between 50 degrees north and 70 degrees north, in the summer months you can see noctilucent clouds. They're just wispy white clouds, very low to the horizon around twilight. Just ice crystals picking up the sun when it's at that certain angle. I do shoot just starry skies. I mean, if you have an interesting composition, some interesting subjects, foregrounds, can create some really beautiful images. Constellations are great. The Big Dipper usually stands out fairly well. Orion in the winter months looks really cool. A couple notes on meteors, because there are a few good shows that you can try and shoot throughout the year. Do try and have high ISOs and shorter exposure times. Meteors are very quick. Sometimes they're not particularly bright, so if your shutter speed is too long, you can average out that bright streak. And unfortunately, most of the meteors are probably not going to be going through your frame, no matter which way your camera is pointing. I usually avoid the moon, but it can be cool to shoot if you're interested in that. You do need some longer lenses if you want to get details, or a telescope like my friend Brian Murray does. But moonlight can also help light up your foregrounds. And don't be afraid of some clouds. So I think one of the most difficult things is finding some good clear skies and getting conditions to line up. But this was actually, when I first started night photography, the first image that I ever licensed to Nikon. And when I was out in the field, I was feeling a little bit disappointed by these clouds coming in and overtaking the Milky Way. But then I started messing around with light painting and just created this funky looking, eerie image. Now we got a quick time lapse to show you, so hopefully this works. I do like to show this one because, as you can see, there's aurora dancing, and it's actually light painting those peaks, kind of pulsing through the time lapse. Okay. So planning these shoots. I mentioned photo pills before. That's one of my go-tos. It has a ton of good tools in it. You can use your phone camera and kind of track the Milky Way. So if you're out during the daytime scouting, you could see where it might be at a certain time of month and day. There's TPE. For weather, windy.com, Astrospheric, Mountain Forecast, Spot WX. Honestly, I check all of these consistently, and a lot of times they don't ever say the same thing, so a little bit of a guessing game sometimes. Sometimes you just have to go. And then if you want to know if you have dark enough skies, a light pollution map like Dark Sight Finder will be useful. The moon will also affect what you can see at night. So if it's really bright, it might wash out aurora, some of the Milky Way stars, but then it could brighten up your foreground. Lots of people are interested in the Milky Way, so a note on when you can see the core. There's usually a 2-week window centered around new moon, and the core is usually up between March and October. In the spring, you can see the core before dawn, in the summer when it's dark, and fall after sunset. And of course, some moonlight while you're shooting the Milky Way can be pretty good. So here's an example with a 50% moon. It was setting, and it actually really lights up the foreground, but it's also washing out the Milky Way and the stars. Because I picked a cooler white balance, I mean, things do look quite blue compared to when there's zero moon and the sky is completely dark, except, there's always light pollution, unfortunately. But that Milky Way really stands out, and there's so many more stars that you can see in the sky. What time of night is best? Usually after the twilight, so you can start to really see the stars. This is a chart from Photopills that shows you civil, nautical, and astronomical and night. I usually start shooting in blue hour or end shooting in blue hour, depending on when I went out. So basically I'll shoot as long as I can still see the stars I want to see, the Milky Way. If the aurora is still bright enough, you can shoot it into blue hour. So here's an example above the town of Banff, taken almost exactly a year ago. So this is Jupiter and Mars. Those are the two stacked almost right on top of each other in the middle, followed by Saturn, so the conjunction last year. And the sky is already brightening. There's kind of that orange hue from the sun coming up, but those planets still stand out pretty well. Can't really see very many other stars, though. This is an example of the darkest time of night that we get so far north. We actually have about a month where we don't get full darkness, but of course, I still go out and shoot. It is dark enough to see a lot of stars, to see the Milky Way. Aurora is another subject people love to know about and try and shoot, and it is very difficult to predict accurately. We are coming out of a solar minimum though, so hopefully it'll be a little bit easier for people to catch a Northern Lights show. I use the NOAA 27-day forecast to kind of get an idea of how far to look ahead and what days might be good. As those days approach, I use either Solar Ham or Space Weather Live to track the data. So there is a bit of a learning curve with trying to figure out how to predict aurora, but there's also the aurora oval, which is pictured here. So basically red means it's probably really good. Green means you might be able to see it. And so of course, the further north you are, to a certain extent, the better your chances. So a few aurora examples. So at my latitude, this is what a KP2 looks like. It's usually just a band or some structures very low to the horizon. This is what a KP5 looks like, so more intense storm. So it actually gets quite good. It can take over quite a big portion of the sky, lots of structure, different colors. This was a quite insane night, so KP8, that's kind of maxing out on the KP scale. I'm actually looking directly south. If you recognize this, this is Bow Lake. I had went out with a friend to try and shoot the Milky Way, and the aurora totally took over everything. Not complaining. And of course, if you're even 60 degrees north, so I was at the very edge of Alberta, a KP1 puts on a pretty good show. So foregrounds and compositions are kind of key to making the image. So I mean, you could go out and just shoot straight up into the sky and shoot some stars, but I think there should be a purpose to the components of your image. And so sometimes that takes a bit of research and scouting, figuring out where certain constellations or stars might be, where the Milky Way could be, which direction you want to be looking in, if anything might block your field of view. And I always encourage you to be to try and be unique, to bring something of yourself into the image, whether like me with the heavy metal or just your own vision and take on a scene. And make sure you get out often. Sometimes it is about getting lucky, and sometimes it is just about taking a chance. This is one of my favorite, basically full-on lucky shots. It was raining everywhere. I went to Lake Louise, I was in Banff. I stopped in Lake Louise to look at the forecast, and I said, oh, well, there might be a hole in the clouds in Field, and I had never been to Emerald Lake before. So I said, well, I'll go check it out because it looks like my only chance. And so I walked around the lake in the dark, not really knowing what to expect. And this mist was just hanging out, but the clouds completely cleared overhead. So I've got a clear view of the Milky Way and probably one-of-a-kind scenes with the lights from the lodge piercing through. The other thing I've noted about this image is it is a blend of exposures because those artificial lights were extremely bright compared to the Milky Way. On the left is a planned shot. So this is again Abraham Lake. I knew where the Milky Way would be, and I had scouted during the day, and I found this really cool crack in the ice that kind of pointed exactly where I wanted it to. So that was a plan that worked out perfectly. On the right, I was actually out shooting Milky Way again in the opposite direction, and all of a sudden I noticed there was some green tinge in some of the pictures I was taking, and I turned around and there's the aurora unexpectedly, and also Steve again lined up perfectly next to Mount Kefren. So just a total chance that I got that shot. Considering positioning and even atmospheric conditions, so with these stars, I carefully framed them with the mountains and this hole I found in the ice of the frozen lake. And I also took advantage of the fact that there was some haze in the sky. And when you do get, just a little bit of haze, it creates star glow, which has this very atmospheric effect. And it just makes the stars look really beautiful. And of course, you can add a human element. I mean, I've done it. I've been out in the middle of a field. Something cool starts happening in the sky, like aurora, and I'll just put myself in the frame so something's happening. In this case, I kind of added to the story of this old building by putting myself in the doorway in the window, lighting up the inside, and just has this kind of surreal, fantastic look to it. And that's it for the night photography presentation. Thank you very much, everyone. If you would like to connect with me, this is my website. I have a bunch of resources on there for night photography, but also other genres as well. I have some tutorials, workshops, and always happy to answer any emails or connect with anyone through email.